Welcome to Norse Nusantara, where I bring you voices in art and living heritage that define and disrupt ideas about the Nusantara, the world's largest archipelago. My guest today is Professor Uta Meta Bauer, a visionary curator, scholar, and institutional leader whose work has shaped the landscape of contemporary art across the globe. She is the founding director of the NTU Center for Contemporary Art Singapore, where she continues as senior principal research fellow and professor at the School of Art, Design and Media at Nanyang Technological University. For more than 3 decades, Uta has curated groundbreaking exhibitions, including as co-curator of Documenta 11 with the late Okui and Wizor, the 3rd Berlin Biennale, and the US Pavilion at the 56th Venice Biennale with the legendary Joan Jonas. She was also expedition leader for the current with TBA 21 Academy, navigating the Pacific archipelagos most vulnerable to climate change. Most recently, she served as artistic director of the Diriyah Contemporary Art Biennale, where she now sits on the advisory board. Welcome to the show, Uta. We've known each other since the founding of NTU Center for Contemporary Art back in 2013. And that was such an exciting and pivotal moment for the art scene in Singapore. So to start us off, could you share what brought you to Singapore and inspired you to establish the center?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. And let's make a long story short. I mean, I did some work in Vietnam, prior to visiting Singapore. And I have been in China a decade earlier, coming with some artists. And so when Singapore planned to have an international arts biennale, they invited a number of biennale curators to what was then called MICA, and the Ministry of Information, Culture, and the Arts.
Yeah.
And so I established some relationships, and out of these relationships, I mean, we kept some contact. I came to see the biennales. And when the Economic Development Board, then under the leadership of Dr. Eugene Tan, embarked on creating an international arts precinct, they reached out to a number of us, including myself, and explained that they also plan to have an anchor institution at Gilman Barracks, which was destined as an gallery hub for international galleries, and that they would also like to have their kind of a Kunsthalle that is under the ownership of a university, which was Nanyang Technological University.
Yeah.
That brought me to Singapore.
Wow, that brings back a lot of memories. And speaking about establishing a center to kind of position the region, could you tell us how the center, to some degree, has positioned the idea of the Nusantara into critical global conversations? How did your understanding of the region evolve through your work in Singapore?
I mean, to start, it was the Center for Contemporary Art actually is the first national research center that got founded with a focus on the arts and on arts research. And so, of course, when we started our programming, which included not only an exhibition space of 800 square meters at Gilman Barracks, it also included an international residency and also to bring in curators and writers. And so we thought, what can make us distinct from other residencies and other regions? And that is that Singapore is such a hub in the region. The museums, Singapore Art Museum, and later National Gallery, which was not then inaugurated, has a focus on Southeast Asia. Right. Singapore is part of ASEAN. So I was very interested also Art Stage, which was then the big fair that started here. also had a focus on VR Asia. So I was wondering, what does that actually mean? And what does Southeast Asia mean? And so first, we also started to look into diaspora. So our first exhibition that inaugurated during actually Art Stage focused on 3 artists actually from Southeast Asia and South Asia that didn't live here.
Right.
It was Trinity Minha, it was Fiona Tan, and Sarina Bimshi.
Right.
And so I wanted to complicate already this idea of what is actually Asia and who is an Asian artist.
And I recall, was that show Paradise Lost?
It was Paradise Lost, of course, which the cliche of the tropics, Southeast Asia is paradise, is Bali, etc. You know, it is very romanticized. And I think we get to that
yes,
onwards.
We will.
But of course, it's much more complex and complicated. There are colonial histories. There is the history of refugees. We have the Vietnam War. We have the history of Indochine, and then later, as I said, Vietnam War. How did this play out for Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, and the complicated relationship after the colonial powers disappeared, the foundation of few nation states. So Paradise Lost has a lot of layers.
Indeed it does. And, you know, speaking of Paradise Lost and the artists you've worked with, artists have always been like center to the work that you do, including the artist residencies at the center. And who are some of the memorable artist residencies that you've had?
I mean, it's hard to say because it has been so many over the decade we were running the residencies. And what we did, we actually included Singapore artists. Initially, they were not part. It was an international residency. And we said, actually, Singaporean artists are also international. So we had these early conversations with the National Arts Council. And very quickly, we embarked to include Singaporean artists in this residency. And they have been really essential to being kind of like hosts to the other artists in the residencies. They are very knowledgeable about the region, and to have this really fruitful exchanges, it was very important to pair and to juxtapose the artists with each other. So it was not just us and Singapore, it's also they spend a lot of time together at Gilman Barracks and also in the flat that residencies artists share. What could be the networks they are establishing and what are the conversations they will have and how will it impact their work moving forward?
And we have some of the footage of some of the artists who have been in residence. For example, this is Suryodarmo.
Actually, a local artist, but then who is a local artist?
What's the definition of local?
Exactly. Yeah. They come, of course, Singapore is a multi-ethnic country. It has 4 official languages. So what is the local culture is already so complex. And it's very interesting. We follow usually artists, and it's the artists who came up with these notions, looking into their cultures. Fire comes out of a Malaysian history, and how does he look into his culture, but also how does this culture look today?
Yes.
He comes out of a very pop cultural point of entry. He's
Indeed,
a young artist of today, a DJ, musician, works with skateboarders, works with bands, works with contemporary design, etc. So, but how does this culture that is also his community play a role, literally also in his artistic production? That is something we were always very interested in. Yeah. And of course, having artists for 3 months, and in case of the local artists, 6 months, we had the privilege to dive much deeper into their artistic practice. And a lot what we did then also in the major exhibitions and also in our publications has been informed by our resident artists.
And we have a couple more examples we could talk about. Speaking of Nusantara, I mean, this is a project by Ila.
Ilan is also very interesting because she was questioning always, what is this term Nusantara? What does it mean? What does it mean for her as a Singaporean artist? And she also worked a lot with her husband, Bani Haikal,
That's right.
who comes from sound, but is also a visual artist. They have a shared performative practice, but then they also have an individual practice, each of them. And she was always very interested in this notion, this relation to the ocean.
Yes.
And what does it mean for Singapore and Singapore's relation to the ocean? Singapore gave up, it's actually Singapore Island, and Singapore
is Singapore Inc. right now.
Slashed the island. And she's questioning this. And to me, it has been, again, very interesting. How do artists understand their locality?
Yeah. And yes, we can see some
very
of that.
Beautiful work. And also how she brings her body into that. This embodied knowledge is very important for Ila, like to how does this inscribe it into herself as a body who lives here in this habitat. And to me, it has been very interesting how much the artists here, and when I say here, I mean the region, Southeast Asia, how much do they see who they are inscribed in their bodies, inscribed in their practice. So it's not that we come up with the topics. The topics came to us through the artists.
Through the artists. And we have two more examples. Robert Zhao.
Also Robert, like again, it's this cliche of what is nature, what is endemic and what is actually not local. And like what we see as tropical forest might be actually not tropical at all. I mean, he does a lot of research. I mean, this is at Christmas Islands about like also the crabs that became such a attractive aspect, but they were not from there, the red crabs, or in Singapore. He did a lot of forest walks behind us at Gilman Barracks, which actually has not been a forest. It was a military barrack, and it's just in the tropics, things overgrow very quickly and look very natural foresty, but they're actually cultivated. So if you look deeper, there is the rest. You see the ruins of a school, and you find many relics of what this place has been. It's kind of like a contemporary ruin in a way, and you can do an archaeology of the recent past. And what looks very nature-like in Robert's work is actually a very cultured history he puts into question.
And then last we have Priya.
Priya Gita Adia is also very interesting. One of the youngest of these artists we just spoke about. And she talks a lot about the history and also the systemic violence that had been embedded in the plantations, both in colonial days, but also in contemporary days of palm oil plantations that are still existing across the region. And it's very interesting because she works a lot now with AI, artificial intelligence. I mean, what you see here is the hand, and the hand is so symbolizing for colonial labor. And her grandmother worked on a plantation. And so this relationship to the hand, the sound, the cultures, the different cultures that actually were coming together by the people who are working on a plantation, historically the colonial powers, the owners of the farms, the people working there. And so she really dissects these layers of cultures who became a new, much more merged culture. And then she actually feeds this into AI and generates a very different, almost spectre-like history. It's like a ghostly history that is still present.
And speaking of ghosts and reversals, from my memory, one of the most outstanding exhibitions at your center that reimagines the Nusantara is Arus Balik, also known in a much extended way, Arus Balik, from below the wind to above the wind and back again. And this is based on a book by Indonesian author Pramoedya Anata. And in his account, he talks about the weakening maritime culture of the Javanese kingdoms, suggesting that the empire's decline was largely caused because the kingdoms turned their backs to the sea.
Yeah, it's part of a trilogy, actually. And particular this book, Arus Balik, has never been translated into English until today. So it was very interesting because we had this exhibition on the occasion of 200 years of Singapore.
For the bicentennial?
For the bicentennial, which was actually celebrating Sir Stamford Raffles.
Right.
And we thought it might be very interesting to invite a perspective that is outside of Singapore.
Beyond that
exactly.
milestone. Yes.
I mean,
what happened before
200 years ago, the map looked very differently.
Yes.
And so I invited Philippe Pirotte, who was then director of the Städelschule in Frankfurt in Germany, but who has very close ties to Indonesia and also to many artists there. And so he invited here, we see, for example, Tuba by Dermawan, which looks into the spice trade. And it is distilling those spices, and they drip on books that talk about the colonial history. And so this notion of the book and books not always have been permitted. So it looks into the colonial history, but also in the more recent history, also of Indonesia, and particular Pramoedya Tor actually was most of his life in jail, not only historically under the colonial powers, but then also when Indonesia became a nation state. And because he was very critical always to the ruling powers. And he said, it's not just, we cannot just blame it on the colonial powers who conquered literally our terra, in that case, Java. We have to look on ourselves. We started to fight each other, in his words. So the sultans and were fighting each other and gave up the sea defense.
Yes.
And this is why they could be conquered.
And they look more inland, I recall.
And they look more inland and less to the connecting tissue, the body of water, which is the ocean, that always connected the wider region, we have to say, because, I mean, it spans quite, as you said in the beginning, a large territory, down to Mindanao, into the Pacific, and then to...
Right down to southern Thailand.
Southern Thailand, exactly. And people would always move across those region, which is a massive region.
And why do you feel that the reversing of lenses or the vantage point is important? Because Arus Balik means like to look.
It's also first of all, it says like historically the movement on the ocean was based on the monsoon. It was based when could you actually go, when could you put up your sails? You definitely didn't want to fight a monsoon.
Right.
So you have to wait until the wind is right. And this is, the title talks about when is the monsoon shifting.
Right.
You know, one direction of the big monsoon goes in one direction and the small monsoon goes in the other direction. And historically, seafarers had to know the monsoon very well if they wanted to survive and if they wanted to go fast, because they had to go with the wind and not against the wind. And in a transmitted, or if you translate it today, are we going with the wind or are we going against the wind? You know, so do we sail along or do we oppose? So it has also a double meaning in a certain way. And it also talks about the complicatedness of those histories. But it speaks also about what always connected this region, that was trade.
Yes.
You know, so it's also what were the exchanges. And then there is no pure culture. We also had in this exhibition, Melati.
Yes.
Like, so she spoke about the practices in the temples and the dances that were there. And like, so, the Hindu influences, then when Islam came to Indonesia. But
very syncretic,
So, exactly. So, syncretism is also part of this region. And so they brought all of this, I would say, complexities to the table in Arus Balik. Also, Ila was part of that show, Shubigi Riau, and Lazy Raven, Zak Langdon Po. So, from New Zealand to Lucy, who is not from the region at all.
And speaking of complexities, and coming back to the region, so, there's often these cliches associated with Southeast Asia, portrayed in popular media. For example, right now the current buzz is with White Lotus. And how then does the center's approach to picturing the regions, challenge this stereotypical, aestheticized touristic images? And why is that important?
Well, that's a very complex question because, of course, the region lives also from tourism. And I remember in the 90s when we always heard, never have been, but always heard, Malaysia is truly Asia on CNN. It was like, I can sing it until today. And so, I always thought Malaysia is truly Asia. So when I came here, I thought, what is this true Asia? And there are so many claims on Asia. And then, of course, Southeast Asia, South Asia. So Southeast Asia is considered this paradise, right? The paradise lost. And of course, the island is Bali.
Yes.
And the myth of Bali, which goes back to Margaret Mead. And
and in Singapore, of course, the Nanyang,
and then,
the historic trip.
And so there were, of course, like in the Pacific, there were very early anthropologists who made these discoveries. And, in Cambodia, you had the later Minister of Culture from France looking into of
course Angkor and
Angkor, etc. And so I think there was always, or Hiroshima, Mon Amour, you have like Marguerite Duras. So there is always this projection also on the region, or you have then the Pontianak, like the ghosts.
Oh, yes.
So the tiger, if you look up.
Yes, all these mythology.
I think White Lotus arrived a bit late to the game. I think Apichatpong, where it's at a cool, and we just spoke before the lazy native.
Yes.
So I think it's, of course, cliches. We love cliches. And I think what the White Lotus actually will do, it shows exactly those layers, people going in a 5-star resort and living the life, but have no clue what's outside. But then their own life starts to unravel within that paradise, So I think it's, if one looks deeper into particular the cliches of the White Lotus, it will unfold these layers of expats, having those layers, those projections on a locality, which actually never really enters this locality. It kind of stays, like Westworld is maybe another TV series who depicted that cliche of where do we go
of
into holidays without
idea.
ever arriving, So, we never reach that place. But then what is that place? And what does the region talk about itself? I mean, if you take Thailand, of course, Koh Samui, Phuket, Angkor Wat, you just mentioned it, So everybody also tries to sell a projection, because
so
tourism,
it goes two ways.
It goes two ways because tourism is a big driver. And I mean, Singapore as the Switzerland of Asia,
Shangri-La in the Himalayas.
It's the cleanliness of Singapore, and I'm always very happy if I can show Singaporeans a normal living quarter, like a kampong that is still existing, going to Katong or going just to a normal HDB neighborhood, and people love it because they want to reach somewhere. They don't want to just reach themselves in another mall where they know every brand from home. So it is a complicated thing. But then, as you say, the tropicality is an equal cliche than the mall.
Yes.
It's almost its counter image.
And as we deep into the deep waters of the Nusantara, let's discuss your work for the oceanic and your role as expedition leader to the Pacific for the research initiative by TBA 21 Academy that hosted expeditions to Papua New Guinea, French Polynesia, and Fiji. We have some footage of the exhibition as well, and I'd like to hear some of your thoughts behind its production as we unravel.
I mean, speaking of the White Lotus, to do an expedition to Papua New Guinea sounded to me a bit like also like these cliches. And I was quite resistant to arrive like white people going there, like visiting the natives, or even like in that case, the oceans. But then really going, I was stunned about the cultural richness. I mean, we look up, for example, Papua New Guinea. We measure countries by their per capita income. But if you don't really need money, because like you live in nature, and I don't say it in a positivistic sense, but not every place has a store, etc. You don't need money. You don't need that kind of income. You still trade, etc. But we're also talking about the cultural diversity. For example, in Papua New Guinea, it's a country with one of the highest biodiversities in the world, and more than 700 actively spoken languages, not dialects. That's a richness I did not know before. And to me, then I also sensed we cannot just like go there, suck it all up, and then walk away. We have to be more reliable. We have to be more sustainable in this relationship. And this year, it's actually 10 years.
Wow.
And we still work with Papua New Guinea at the moment with the new island, the Bismarck Sea, where deep sea mining is returning. It was for a while gone. At the moment, there are discussions about a moratorium to ban deep sea mining for a few more years until we really understand the environmental impact more clearly. It will have impact there. We don't need to explore that. That's clear. But what will be the longer term impact in different localities? That is still to be studied. And so in an odd way, the Pacific kind of like has this draw, you go and you come back, you go and you come back. Right. So it's now 10 years that I work with a relatively steady group. We work with lawyers, we work with forensic architecture, we work with visual artists, but also with scientists, with NGOs. But also in Fiji, we worked with the German embassy on an inaugural conference together with the Oceania Center. Looking into cultural exchanges, Singapore has been part of the Small Island Nation Groups Association. And so literally looking back, where are the connections? How does the ocean connect all of these localities? And what are also the political relationships today? What are the academic relationships? What are the knowledge exchanges? And that's something that we're still very involved also with the CCA to come back, which it was a national research center. Right. Now it's a research center within NTU. And today we are very entangled and part of the climate transformation program, a more recent initiative supported by the Ministry of Education of Singapore.
Oh. And going back to what you said about connections, and this podcast, we're talking about picturing, the power of picturing. How does visual production help in developing this?
We just have this image here, which on the back we see works by Noel Harry, an Australian artist who spent quite a big deal of time in the Pacific, in Papua New Guinea. And so he was part of the first trip, but I also invited Laura Anderson-Barbata, a Mexican artist who works since 25 years with 2 Yanomami tribes in the Amazon, because I didn't want to go there and without an experience. So I wanted to have artists with me who literally work in this context, Newell, who work directly in the region, in Milne Bay province, and Laura Anderson, who has this experience working with communities who don't have so much contact. I don't want to say with the outside, but with people from the West. Let's call it more like that. And what you see here is also a collection of tabak cloth. And tabak cloth is not necessarily just from PNG. It comes from different parts. And it always has been on the one side used in ceremonial dresses, but also as a matter of exchange. It's a currency, like cowrie shells are actually a currency. And is traded in what is called, for example, in the region there in Milne Bay province, it's called a kula ring, which were ceremonial exchanges, also to negotiate hostility, friendliness across the tribes, across the societies. And but for us, it's very interesting because we see today tablecloths in museums, museum holdings, anthropological museums, etc. But very often they enter the collection by the name of the collector, not necessarily by where they come from, and not necessarily by who generated them, which communities. So that's a more recent research, which in that case also a former colleague from NTU who is now at Arizona State University, Professor Christy Kang. She looked into tablecloths across collections globally. And with the help of AI, maybe can be, as now collections are digitized, through pattern recognition, maybe can be traced to narrow the place of origins and maybe identify actually what belongs to which community. So in order also to understand how did they move, why did they move, by whom were those items moved, and to understand again much more these notions of exchanges and conversations that happened centuries ago.
Yes, it's amazing that, through the visual production, how you have a window into systems and patterns and movement of people is what you said, which then brings me to my next question from the oceanic, which led to climate crisis and cultural loss, where this was a project that brought together your Pacific experience with something much closer to home here.
When we embarked, after Papua New Guinea, where we already then were confronted and heard about like the Nautilus, which was then a company who already then wanted to embark on deep sea mining in the Bismarck Sea. We also spoke about a nuclear ocean, all the nuclear tests. So we were in French Polynesia, which has like the Marshall Islands, Bikini Islands, faced a lot of the impact of nuclear testing on their communities, with a long-term impact and devastating impact. The cancer rates are very high, and which is still kind of not really acknowledged in its dimension until today. So we looked also into this. And then, of course, we also saw the impact of climate change acceleration, El Nino combined with an increasing rate of cyclones. And what does that mean for the region? So going into this paradise, you suddenly also see devastation in paradise, and not only extinction of languages, of habitats, of biodiversities, but you also still look onto a continued impact of what we call anthropogenic intervention, man-made interventions that actually contribute to climate change, and that contribute to an acceleration of climate change. And very often people say, but it's just like, there is 100 people or a few hundred people living on an atoll. What does this have to do with us? Can't they just be moved? They contribute maybe just 2% to CO2 emissions, while we generate 98%. And we're saying, it's just a few hundred people who have to be moved. No, a whole region will be impacted. And people on these atolls and islands, they're actually guardians of the ocean, of the fish that we eat come from certain regions. This are their spawning grounds. So we don't even have looked into these connections. Yes, scientists do, biologists do, but the general population says always, we didn't know that. So that's something where we see we should get more involved, talking more about that, but also giving more voice to the people living there. how do they live? What are they doing? They're not just a few natives who live on an atoll. They're actually stewards and guardians of maybe the food that we need on our table.
And speaking of those communities, Uta, you are still continuing to work with them. Could you tell us about?
It's not just me. It's a whole network of people. I mean, there are researchers all over. There are advocates all over. There are artists actually working in their communities. I mean, Mata Asienza on Batanayan Island in the Philippines. Yi Ilan working in Sabah with weavers. As I said, Marta, she works with plastic waste, but also looks into the importance of mangrove restoration. Then we have Marian Pasterojes in the Celebes Triangular in Mindanao, where a lot of fish spawning grounds are in the Philippines. Today, the Philippines, historically, not the Philippines. So, we're looking also a lot into regions like, West Papua is Indonesia, but it's only part of Indonesia because it was part of Batavia. It was part of the Dutch East Indies. So, so we have to look into those networks and then actually to whom were these groups connected before? And then what also, like how can we literally also engage with the region in support? Like if you look up food prices in Vanuatu, for example, they are extremely high because after 3 cyclones, there's hardly food growing. So everything has to be imported and the prices are through the roof and the people cannot afford food anymore. And what do we have to do with it? Yeah, we contribute to accelerated climate change. So the damage and loss funds that are discussed at the COP. So you suddenly realize what I first thought is, what do I do in Papua New Guinea? Suddenly sounds more, actually, how do we have a conversation with Papua New Guinea and the other islands in terms of shared responsibility? So it really changed my position 180 degrees. And I feel today obliged to engage.
Right.
While in the beginning I was hesitant to engage.
And speaking of engagement, could you share about the engagement that you have with communities living on water, which is closer to Singapore?
Yeah, it's much more, I would say.
We have some of the photos,
Yeah, in the region, this is our research group. That's Christy Kang, for example, here, who works actually on the tapa cloth. And then next to her is Professor Nabil Ahmed, an architect, part of forensic architecture initially, who has a group called Interpret. And he looks onto big data on actually into damages that are caused by dumping toxins into the ocean, nuclear testing, etc. He really looks into this larger picture, acidification of oceans by mines. And he's from Bangladesh initially, so his country, of course, is also impacted by deforestation, etc. And so this is this mixed research group, but we were also able to bring a local chief from Fiji, from the Tuamotu Islands, from Totoya Islands to Singapore to have these exchanges. Here we are in a group. They live near Kaval in Bintan. They're actually Bachao,
which is just an hour away from Singapore. But
it's an hour away, but people stay mainly
on the water
in a resort. But it's such an interesting.
The tourists,
No, it's such an interesting community. This is here we have already that are images near Kaval. So, and then we also, there in Barakit is a big group of Orang Laut that move between Batam and Bintan in Indonesian waters, but there are still also island descendants living in Singapore. And it's so interesting over the time. We got invited to visit them because we spent quite some time there, really relaxing on the weekend and doing all this work in the Pacific. I said, do I actually look in the neighborhood? I actually don't. So we met with colleagues from NOS in Johor, and looking into the reality of the fishing communities, like because of the traffic and the container boats, pollution, etc. Their livelihood is very much in danger. There are not many kelongs left in Singapore. And so we started to look into these connections, and from where does the fish come, and what's the relationship between these island groups that are actually in proximity. And so we started to look into mangrove restoration projects there, coral restoration projects. And it would be wonderful if there can be more exchanges. It's politically not so easy because it's different nations and it's way beyond what we do. We are just looking literally in exchanges with the communities. How can scientists learn from each other? There is in Bintan is also a university that looks into coral restoration, mangrove restoration, and how can we have exchanges? And on the other side, we also try to collaborate with the different Laut groups and understanding their traditional way of life. But of course, you have in Bintan, you have Bugis, you have Flores people, you have Bachao people. This is the harbor in Caval, where a lot of fish is traded actually also to Singapore. And so
you can show the pictures. It's quite...
so, you suddenly understand an hour from here is a very active,
thriving,
dynamic coastal community. And we look in this moment also on sea level rise, also in Singapore. What do we understand from living on water?
Yes, tell us.
We became such a land-focused nation.
Yes.
The coast is basically owned by the ships, by the harbor. So, can we really live on water? The projections for Singapore with sea level rise are eminent. They're not looking pretty.
I mean, we know that with Indonesia, with Jakarta, and that's why they are moving their capital.
They moved already the capital to Borneo.
Because of the rising water levels?
Jakarta is more complicated because it's sea level rise and it's a sinking.
Okay, there you have
sinking, because the groundwater they use up so much water. So the groundwater causes a sinking of the land mass. And then sinking and sea level rise is a very challenging combination, combined with floods. So that's a very challenging condition, I would say. But of course, Indonesia doesn't move.
They could move
15 million people. No, they only move the government, which is a few thousand people. The rest will stay in this condition, which is very challenging for the people there. They're moving, they're trying to have landfills, stabilizing again, to reinforce peatlands and mangrove as to basically secure erosion and to counter sea level rise is a very important mitigation strategy. So we should have much more exchanges across the region, how to address this. Southeast Asia will be one of the most impacted regions by climate change.
I mean, this reminds me of the film Waterworld with Kevin Costner, talking about utopia becoming dystopia.
We have also artists at the moment, which to me is very interesting. They're doing projections, films generated already by AI. We have next week a screening. And at the CCA, combining again somebody engaging into flood management, and on the other side, an artist teaching at NTU, projecting what is a post-catastrophic scenario, also in a metropolis. Not just Singapore can be, Hong Kong can be, Bangkok. All of our major capital metropolises are subject to sea level rise. How will this look?
How will this look indeed?
So I'm not necessarily just a supporter of doomsday. So to me, it's very important to say actually living on water can be something also very positive.
So this is the light, because they have the knowledge and...
I mean, the Lauts were the stewards of the region. They were kind of the army of the sultans of this region. Actually, the capital was in Bintan. So there are still very important kramats.
Yes, I recall.
So it wasn't always Johor.
Yeah, not all. Yeah.
There's a more complex history.
Yes.
Then there's Palembang, there's Sumatra.
Yes.
So the longer you are here and you're looking into this, you see this very complex pre-colonial history. Then you see the colonial history. Then you see the post-colonial history. Then you see the young nation states. And here you see Marian Pasteroches, a very important scholar and researchers from the Philippines, looking into textiles, dream weavers, looking into complexity of multi-religious tension, let's say in Mindanao. How can this be overcome? So she's working on creating a museum for all the faces. So can they be living together? In what way? She looks into women who are often more interested in conversation than confrontation. So, how can we approach things differently? Yeah. And she was very stunned to find Bachao community in Bintan. She could not believe it.
In terms of distance to Mindanao,
it's massive, but people did move all the time.
Yeah. On
a much longer stretch. I mean, if you look Austronesia, people went on what we call ukuleles. I mean, they're kind of like floats.
On this very streamlined...
No, they had catamarans. Right. They had very slim boats. They have the technology they had of going big distance without motors.
Technology and knowledge.
They understood the winds.
Yes.
They understood the currents.
They did.
And they could read the ocean. So Captain Cook had a native, actually guiding him across the waters and bringing him to certain islands he never knew. So this connection, celestial navigation, actually captains today starting again to study celestial navigation. Yeah. And again, oceans, when we were with our captain, we could only sail on daytime because he said he has no maps of the region in the Pacific. Only 70% of the ocean is actually cartographed, is mapped. So we don't really have maps of the deep sea. This is why also deep sea mining, before we even understand what's down there, is so sensitive. And this year at the United Nations Seabed Authority, they're actually discussing if the moratorium that will end this year will be extended. And again, Singapore played an important role in this. Tommy Koh, UN ambassador at large, was very involved in the formation of the United Nations Seabed Authority. So it always comes together again.
It does. It does. And well, Uta, as we wrap up the series, I just have one concluding question for you. So, so far we've talked about in a time where there's deepening climate crisis and cultural erasure, what role do you believe picturing the region can play, not just in reflecting the challenges, but somewhat contributing to or giving strategies or solutions to our sustainability and survival? Can art in this region be a source of reimagining?
I think we're facing at the moment a big backlash on globalization. I think COVID just accelerated that, and at the fear of losing one's place in the world. I would not only say in terms of trade, but to where does one belong? And that really increases nationalisms, localisms in a more tense way. But I think it's important to understand cultural difference in a positive way. The riches of cultures, learning from each other. We don't need to become United Nations of Benetton or something. We don't need to be one world. We are one planet, but we have diversity, and then we have hybrid cultures. In Singapore, Peranakan cultures are a very important hybrid culture. In Africa, we see dialects like Wolof, etc., which are languages. They're already merged
And they've
languages.
coexisted here for centuries.
Bahasa is a merged language of the traders, and like while local languages were very different. So marketplaces, pidgin English, it comes from marketplaces, from trade. So to look into language history, to look into cultural diversity, but also to look, people were always connected by waterways, by landways, the Silk Road, you know, so trading was always kind of a positive thing. We wanted to have something from afar. I mean, the national dish in Brazil is bacalhau, but it actually comes from Norway, you know, so.
It was more than just transactional. It was
more than
connection.
No, I would not always say friendships. It was also negotiations, but one always saw the riches, the marketplaces, the bazaars, the souks that sell the riches of the globe were spaces of excitement. Our dishes, you know, like if you look up, Peranakan Kitchen has a lot of spices involved, and they're not just coming from here. They were traded, which also goes back to Dermawan, to Tuban, looking into those spices and looking to where they come from and looking what they generate. And what we think is a national dish might actually not be local at all. And I think it's very important when we're looking extinction of species. If you go to a marketplace in a supermarket, we don't see the riches of the local wet markets in a supermarket reflected. So to really protect and respect what constituted this planet, the human and the post-human alike, I think is really something we should bear in mind, respect, and if needed, fight for.
Wow. Uta, thank you so very much for joining us on Nusantara and, you know, your thoughtful reflections on how art navigate between cultural memory, environmental urgency, and regional complexity has given us so much to think about. You know, you've reminded us that the idea of the Nusantara is not just static, and it's oceanic, evolving, and deeply interconnected. And I just want to say I'm so grateful for your insights, and I know our listeners will be too.
Thanks so much for having me. And again, I just have to say I'm so grateful to Singapore, because Singapore is in the middle of all of this, and it has all of these elements in a nutshell embodied. And it took me a while to see this beyond the mall, the air-conditioned nation, and to understand it's still alive. And I think it's something Singapore should treasure.
Oh, thank you, Uta. Thank you.
Thank you, dear listeners, for tuning in to this episode of Noor's Nusantara. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, and subscribe to this podcast to hear more from leading thinkers and creators on picturing the Nusantara.